so much for being here. I'm going to try to do as little talking as possible because I'm really excited to have you here, Mark. So my name's Dan. I'm designer, founder, co-founder at Pistol Shrimp with Fred Ford over here. And I'll just say that much. Fred, how about you?
I'm Fred, co-founder of Pistol Shrimp with Dan over here. I've had a long history in the game industry, a lot of it paralleling Mark's history. I worked on Star Control 1 and 2 with Paul Ritchie and a bunch of games for Crystal Dynamics. And then later, IDOS, I guess they became kind of. And then Activision for the latter part of my corporate career. And now I'm independent and working with Dan again, and we're working on a sequel to the Ur-Quan Masters, which was an open source release of the copyrighted material in Star Control 2.
Yeah, so I'm Mark Darrah. I worked at BioWare from 1997 to 2021, finishing up as the executive producer for Dragon Age. And now I'm consulting with them on finishing up Dragon Age Dreadwolf right now.
So, this is sort of the selfish, greedy question, but as someone who is there, how did you feel the influence of Ur-Quan Masters?
Ur-Quan Masters, you definitely see it in Mass Effect, because I think if you look at Mass 1 and Mass 2 to a lesser degree, but Mass 1 especially, through the lens of Ur-Quan Masters, it's essentially the trilogy is almost like that game kind of twisted. It's got the Mako on the planets. It's got even the way that Mass Effect 3 ends. One of the endings is essentially like putting the Earth into that sort of protective state, the same as the way that Ur-Quan Masters starts. So it's the fingerprints are all over the place. Casey definitely considers it one of the most influential games for him. So yeah, I think it's like in terms of setting, but also in terms of the idea of going to a lot of different places and having some of them be influential and some of them be like things you dip in and out of. I think that's something that Mass Effect really wanted to do was you go to a planet, and this planet is a place you stop for a moment and it's like you learn a little bit, but really it's about gathering resources and moving on. Like I think it's really trying to be present in the Mass Effect series. I don't know that it's actually as successful as Ur-Quan Masters is at any point, but you can see it trying to do that.
Yeah,
it was a very successful game, that's for sure. Mass Effect.
Yeah, we have a good fandom crossover from personal experience.
I would expect so. Yeah.
Yeah. When making get a little more nuts and bolts than that, but when making a big open world game, and you want to encourage the player to be able to dip in and dip out versus, hey, this is somewhere important. How do you approach it as sort of like, okay, what's going to work, and how do you incorporate playtesting? Are there processes that you found are really helpful?
Playtesting can be tricky for that kind of game because it takes so long. You can do them and you should do them. But it can be tricky because you need people to sit down and play it for a long time, and you really need them to play it as a real player. One thing that can happen with a lot of playtesting, in my experience, is the situation is very artificial. So either I've only got 5 days to play this game that's hundreds of hours long, so I'm going to play it in a very unnatural way because I want to see as much of the main story as possible, so I don't engage with the open world aspects. Or I feel like you're evaluating me on, like, you tell me that you're wanting to evaluate the open world, so I do almost the opposite. I engage just in the exploration part and ignore the the actual game almost completely. If you can, something that I see done quite successfully is heat maps, which I think you can do with playtesting, but where you see what people are doing as opposed to guiding them or as doing questionnaires, is you just kind of observe what they're doing. Ideally, in a big playtest without those constraints in place. But even if you have to gather people in a room and give them pizza, I think it can still work. Something that Mass 2 struggled with is it had a lot of people just went planet scanning for, like, they basically planet scanned every single planet, stop playing the game, planet scanned every single planet, and then sort of picked it up. So it's almost like they had Mass 2 for some people turned into essentially 3 games. Everything you did before you started planet scanning, all of the planet scanning, and then in the end. And then a lot of people just kind of stopped playing in the middle of the planet scanning because it was pretty thin. So I think if you want people to dip in and out, you do sometimes kind of have to force the issue. So something that was discussed after the fact for Mass 2 was, if the Normandy can only carry 9 probes or something, then it's like, okay, you go out, you probe 9 planets, then you got to go do something else to get more probes. Even something like Skyrim gets around it by, well, your inventory's full. So, you got to go back to town eventually because your inventory is full. So we're going to force you to at least remember, if you want to, ignore the critical path, fine, but at least we're going to force you back into more populated spaces as opposed to wandering off forever. So I do think it's important, if you want people to be dipping in and out, that you push them back and forth somehow. So if they're on the crit path, there's something that's going to push them back out into the open world if that's what you want them to do. Dragon Age Inquisition does that with powers. Like, you need more power in order to advance the crit path. So you've reached a blocking point, you have to engage in the open world. Now, what Inquisition didn't do a very good job of was, now that you're out in the open world, pushing you back to the critical path. So you got some people getting sort of lost out there forever.
Yeah, Ur-Quan Masters had an out there and back with only really one home to go back to, and it was very much inventory limits. I think we like, having watched players play, especially recently, modern players playing for the first time, where people seem to get lost is, I've got all the resources I need, I have everything, but I'm missing the hint. Classic old adventure game kind of problem, where like, oh, okay, well, now you're engaging in the open world. And, maybe it's not bad if a player really just loves going down to planet surfaces, good for them. But if they're trying to find something, sometimes they could get a little lost as sort of the layers of easily accessible things kind of get peeled off. And then they're like, okay, I have all the resources, I have all the weapons, but I just don't know what to do. And that was, I think, a challenge.
The interesting thing for me for Ur-Quan Masters is there's a time limit. Like an actual real time limit. And I having worked on like Baldur's Gate 1 had a time limit. I don't know that you can do that anymore. I'm not sure that players are willing to, or you'd have to be, or I think if you did it now, you'd have to be so, like, just so you know,
up front, yes,
for reals.
Yeah. Product of its time. Back then, like King's Quest games and stuff like that, you step wrong by 1 pixel and it's game over.
Yeah, like though I do think that Baldur's Gate 3 shows that that's a game that for a AAA or nearly AAA game makes no compromises to modern sensibilities, and seems to have gotten away with it to a large degree.
Yeah, they have some pretty brute force kind of like, here's the big dialogue, are you really sure? It's not necessarily time limited, but it's classic JRPG kind of like, are you sure you're ready to proceed? Something bad's going to happen. You don't know how that's going to happen. In an open world game, or I love Baldur's Gate 3, but in an open world game, trying to balance both like that need and also a time limit. Yes, product of its time, definitely. I died so much in King's Quest, But one other thing that I appreciate about Baldur's Gate 3 that we're trying to do for our game is allow for co-op play and have an open world and let players explore that. And one tricky aspect we found is if players can do whatever they want, what happens when one player steps over the tripwire, the no going back tripwire, while the other player isn't? I don't know if you've had any experiences with
I
that.
mean, so Fail Better Games talks about their storytelling is, they talk about campfires in the dark. The basic concept being that if you are here at this moment of story basically has no idea how you got here, just that you're here. And they do it through basically in Fallen London, everything's a currency. So all they know is you have, reputation constables 60, and they don't know how you did that. Maybe you saved the inspector's daughter. Maybe you just bought a lot of tickets to the ball. They don't know. They don't care. You see that a lot in Baldur's Gate 3 as well, where a lot of their storytelling is just, you got here. I have no idea how, but I'm just going to basically roll with it and go with it. So, in the case of Baldur's Gate 3, they kind of just keep everyone together, so to avoid the tripwires. But I think the short answer, I guess, for me would be have as few tripwires as possible. But you're right. There's some points like, okay, well, now you've started the doomsday clock, and I'm still in the starting level. Now what? I think to some degree, if we're all playing together, maybe that's just the consequence of the situation, and we're all playing together but not together. So I'm still getting my feet wet, and you've gone and you've triggered the end of the game. Okay, here we go, I guess.
Yeah, let the players decide for themselves what their fun version is.
Yeah, and I think so. I mean, one of the struggles, I've had a lot of struggles in my career with getting the team invested in multiplayer storytelling. You see it done very well in BG3, but BG3 does it the way that BG 1 and 2 did it, which is actually slightly differently. But basically, we're playing together in a single world. Like we've made a pact. It's not a bunch of different games that come together and then go apart. It's like we're playing together in a single situation. And maybe because BioWare just has such a history of narrative driven and writing, but I did a video about this, but you kind of in multiplayer, it's like you have to decide whose world are we playing in, whose story are we experiencing, whose character is this, and in BG1 and BG2, the answer is just yours. I'm playing with you. I've joined your game. I'm controlling your characters. Even though maybe you let me do the character creation for this, it's still yours. If I don't come, you've got full control of that character. And I think that's a perfectly legitimate answer to the question, which is just like, yeah, there's one person who's basically owning the universe, and everyone else is kind of joining their world. There's certainly a potentially better version of it where it's like somehow it's our world, or it's my character, and my character comes into your game. And you see that with Elden Ring, where it's like my character sort of teleports into your universe, but then it's your universe, and I play around for a little bit, and then I teleport back to my universe. I mean, the goal, I think, or the dream would be that it's ours. Somehow it's my character in our universe telling our story. But like you said, if it's our story, well, then if we don't have to stay together, I can go and push the do not push button and make the game end, and you don't even know what's happening because the game just ended.
Yeah, one thing that I appreciate about, Baldur's Gate 3, and then of course, the Divinity Original Sin games is, the parity between the single player experience and the co-op experience is there. You're controlling 4 characters or however many you have in your party, no matter what. And so when there's an interloper joining your friend who you're happy to have there, it's not like they added something that wasn't there. They've just
Yeah.
kind of, they're possessing a character, you know, and maybe love or hate or whatever, you know, and
Yeah.
they've brought someone in, and they, you know, they're pretty upfront about that. And I appreciate the sort of elegance of, well, single player and co-op are kind of the same. It's just who's controlling who.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly what Larian is doing. And I actually would be like, that's my answer to the question as well, which is basically make no compromises. The single player game is, if the single player game has primacy, then what does the multiplayer therefore look like? Well, I can't add additional characters because that would make the multiplayer experience the better experience because we have more power. So I have to be staying within that box. And that's essentially, I think, for me, if storytelling is one of your primary pillars, I think that has to be the answer, because otherwise, if multiplayer is one of your primary pillars, then I think maybe you could do something differently and encourage multiplayer. But if it's supposed to be an experience where it's on the same level, which is what BG3 is definitely going for, then I think you really need to. I think it helpfully answers a bunch of questions for you.
Yeah, if we can do that, which is, you know, definitely not necessarily Ur-Quan Masters, where you had one character who is the captain. And then there's,
I mean, but like, it's interesting because if you imagine Ur-Quan Masters, I mean, I guess this is what you guys are doing right now, but if you imagine Ur-Quan Masters and there are 7 ships controlled by 7 different people, a lot of it is fine because we're just out there and we're scanning different planets. But there are a couple of moments where it's like, whoopsie doodle, this guy, like, yeah, he crossed a tripwire and now stuff is going on.
yeah, exactly. And and also if there's sorry, go ahead, Fred.
No, I was just going to say, just in a story-based game, it's also hard to get the same people together again all the time if you want to.
Well, that's why I feel like you either need an answer of it's yours. So there's sort of, it's my game. And if you don't show up, I can just play without you. Or it's somehow ours, which is if any of us shows up, we can push the universe forward. But then I think that works better in like the MMO experience or the open-ended. There's no real end to the story. So there are no tripwires in an MMO. The universe stays, my story changes, but the universe stays the same. So you not playing with me doesn't break your story. Whereas in a Dragon Age game, if we're in Act 3 and you miss a session, well, hey, we beat the bad guy, so you know, never mind, we're all done.
Yeah, I think you know, having played D&D for years and years, there's sort of an aspect of, hey, if someone can't make it for a session, you know, that's fine. We'll play the session without them. We'll catch them up. There's a recap, you know, next week. We're also coming off of, you know, well, I worked on Skylanders and Fred worked on Skylanders too, but I wasn't there for Ur-Quan Masters. But on Skylanders, you know, we had what some people lovingly refer to as like younger sibling co-op, which is drop in, drop out. One player can play, but another player can play. And one of the things I love about Skylanders co-op in particular, which is different goal than storytelling, is you can have a highly skilled player playing with a very low skill player, and they can still have fun together. And, you know, Baldur's Gate does a good job of that too, I think.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of fun in just saying, hey, you don't have to be competent. Just come play with me. It's going to be fun. We'll have fun together. And that's just the sort of bonding experience. I know it was a, you know, younger kids game, but bonding experiences and just, you know, just like people bond over D&D is really fun to have when they storytell together.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's another way to look at multiplayer, which is the idea of it's my game, but you can play with me. So it's a shared experience, but it's only a shared experience for as long as we are sharing together. But then it goes back to being mine again as soon as you leave, as opposed to like if you play BG 1 or 2, it is very much, if we decide to play it multiplayer, we're making this commitment up front. It's basically like tabletop. And it's like, if you don't show up, I can play without you, but I feel like I'm breaking a social contract to do so. So I do think that there's something interesting there. I mean, my big MMO was City of Heroes. That was the one and it had sidekicking and mentoring, which was the same idea. Like, I have a 50th level character. I can take your 3rd level character and essentially up level them into a very simple 50th level character, and you can play with me, or I can essentially knock myself down to be a 3rd level character and we can play with you. There's something interesting with that in terms of, but again, it does require that doesn't make a ton of sense if there's a really strong story arc.
Yeah.
That's like, well, but I already defeated the gorillas. What are we doing fighting these gorillas?
Yeah, well, maybe the answer is in the D&D your friend skipped a session, which is, well, if they need to know what's happening, you can fill them in, you tell them. And you know, I don't know, maybe that would be, since I like to have idle thoughts about games I'm never going to have time to figure out. But what if there's this storytelling recap thing for a player who wasn't there for a while, and it could build in this little like text replay? I don't know how it would actually work.
I mean, definitely there are trying to think if Inquisition did this, but one of the Dragon Ages did that, where it's like, okay, you didn't recap back to the last point a person played, because obviously the last person, it was just, but it would recap essentially what was going on in the moment. But there's nothing stopping you from like recapping, like, okay, well, let's just
take a slice.
Yeah, like we'll just collect the critical plot points that have happened since last you logged on, and then we'll just give those to you. And it shouldn't be very much. I mean, even if your game is 100 hours long, you're probably only needing to recap every 4 or 5 hours at most.
Yeah, or like D&D, we can leave it up to the players to decide what's important, you know, because it's an open world game. For all I know, they thought finding a planet full of lizards was the most important thing, and not whatever the main story was.
And I do think that there absolutely is, you're definitely right about that. I think there is a certain hubris that comes with the storytellers in open world, where we feel like we know what is going to be the most important storytelling. But by telling that to the player, we are to some degree undermining the storytelling that they're doing to themselves, because we're essentially telling them the thing they thought was important wasn't important. So leaving it to them, it lets them tell the stories that they're telling themselves, and not, undercutting that in some way.
Yeah, there's a naturally evolved metaphor that's come up lately on the team. It's topical too, which is because it was Thanksgiving. There's some people who like Thanksgiving because of the turkey, and some people who are just there for the sides. And it's okay. You kind of need both. You can't undermine either one. But for some people, like for me as a player, like my most memorable parts of Ur-Quan Masters are, well, these sort of off in the corner tangential things that happen, because those stuck with me. So I was there for the sides. Now, if it didn't have a main thing holding it all together, I probably wouldn't keep playing. But, honoring like, hey, let players decide what they thought was the coolest thing, right? It's very hard.
I think there's a lot of power in that metaphor, because if you go to a Thanksgiving dinner and all they have is a turkey, that's no good. But you also don't want to go to a Thanksgiving dinner and all they have is sides. So like you might care about one or the other more, or even almost entirely, but you still need the rest of it for it to be a complete dinner.
Yeah, totally. Well, so to like pivot a lot, I'm enjoying this a ton. But one thing we see, especially with like story, and you see this with Mass Effect, saw this with Dragon Age, saw it with Ur-Quan Masters, or I've perceived it, is there's fandoms, and the fandoms get created, and they're often around like little niche things. There are people who are in it just for the siren, they were brought in and they're like, this is the coolest thing in the world. I love it. There are people who love the doctrinal conflict between the Korra and the Ur-Quan. And so there's sort of this idea, and this feels very marketing oriented, but there's this idea of like, from a creative standpoint, like how can you make a fandom? What creates a fandom? And what is it to make a game that you want someone to not just play and have fun with, but also fall in love with. I mean, you see it, if you, like an extreme example would be like League of Legends, right? You know,
Right.
say, okay, well, their game is selling because of the fandom. They have music, they have characters, they've got interwoven stories. There's a million contact points with their media, even if you never play the game. So just for like a humble, you know, game maker, you know, after the fact, you can say, well, it's cool that a fandom was built up, but is there are there chemical compounds or things that you can see and say, ah, there's a reason there people could be fans of this?
I think there is somewhat, because I think there needs to be enough there, but not too much there. I think actually League of Legends is an excellent example, because with League of Legends, there's the overall story of the universe very, very thin. Every character has essentially an origin story. They have like a background and a story, and there's a lot to catch on to with that character. But if you don't like this character, if you don't like the girl riding the animatronic teddy bear, then whatever, we'll move on. You want it like Westerns, we got a Western character, so they have a lot of little attachment points to grab onto. Whereas if you see something like I don't know, like a Call of Duty or something like that, not one of the Black Ops, but like just a normal Call of Duty, there's nothing there. Like, it's just like, so there's nothing to grab onto. But on the other side, and I'm trying to think of an example of this, if there's too much there, if everything is in the box, like I'm going to give you the box and it contains literally the entire universe, then there's nothing to kind of chew on. You want there to be unanswered questions and things to think like, well, how did we get into this situation? Let's talk about it on the Reddit post. In fact, I've seen this happen with Dragon Age games, when like David Gator would, back when BioWare had its own forums, would go into the discussions about lore and stuff and answer the questions. They didn't really want that. Like, they thought they did, but when he did it, it just sucks all the life out of the conversation. Because if I'm like, oh, I really wonder if maybe the Canary are secretly bird people, and someone comes in, no, they're not, and you're like, oh, well, okay. Like, so like I think it's a pretty wide gap between not enough and too much. Like, I think there's a lot of different games that fall in that world. I mean, I just played Unpacking. I don't know if you've played Unpacking. Yeah. Like you can have a conversation about that game, about the story in that game, because you're like, oh, well, what happened here? Why did that happen? Like, why did I have to put my art college degree in a drawer when I was moved in with my boyfriend? Like, what's going on? Yeah. Like, there's a whole, but it's not answered. Like, the next thing is just, oh, I guess I moved home. I guess that ended badly, or maybe not. Who knows? Maybe it didn't end badly. I mean, my assumption is that it did, but
yeah, for me, I actually really loved Unpacking, and it was I think thought of it like an inverse detective game. It's not a detective game where I get to solve the puzzle because that's required to proceed. It's that, oh, in the process of playing, I'm sort of constructing a reality. There's a few hard facts, and it's not required to progress the game, but what am I doing while I'm doing all this stuff? I'm kind of trying to imagine the story in my head. Like, why, like you said, why is this here? What happened? And then you get the little like hard bits while you're playing, and then the interstitial moments, you know, and it's like, oh, between the scenes, here's what happened. And even just seeing like, oh, we went from this big place to this small place. What happened? You know?
Yeah. I'm a sucker for anything that tells story without words. And Unpacking does that amazingly. And I think Ur-Quan Masters does it too. Like, you're watching the things change and evolve as you go. And for me, I mean, having worked at a studio that did almost all its storytelling through words, in fact, spent decades training the writers to trust other departments to be able to tell story, even through acting, like through facial acting. To anytime I see storytelling done through environment or through like player action, that's amazing to me. That's a thing that I love to see.
Yeah, it's, I mean, this could be a whole topic to get on, but actually just what you said, I'm curious what your experiences are like, because we have our own like learnings about getting departments to trust each other. I mean, that could be that's its own
Yeah.
video. But like getting departments, but especially, something that's coming for us, for example, is like the art doesn't need to tell this story. This story will be part of the words, and vice versa, which
Right.
is, we don't need the words to do this. The picture is going to do a much better job of selling this part of their story. If they were to start explaining it, it loses the charm. So what were your experiences trying to get different departments to, I guess, build a shared vision of who this
Yeah.
character is as it's being made?
It's really hard because back in the early day in Baldur's Gate 1, the art couldn't really tell much story at all. I mean, the characters are this big and they're like really far away, so it all kind of had to come through the words, and I guess the environment art. You could tell some story with telling. You could do some storytelling with the environment art itself. The dangerous thing is that you can get into a situation where you are like, so with a Dragon Age game, you're sort of trying to get the writers thinking from the perspective of, imagine this is a television show or a movie or something like that. And if you wouldn't say it out loud in a television show or a movie, you probably shouldn't be saying it out loud or writing it down in this game. But it's still incredibly expensive to do cinematics. So sometimes you succeed at that. You get them to trust, and that trust is, it maybe not misplaced, but simply we didn't have the budget to do the 3-minute long cinematic that would have been the better way to do this. And in fact, we needed you to say, and then a castle full of castles crashed into another castle and blew an entire universe up. Like, you're not filming that. You gotta just say that, or you gotta find another way to do it through visual storytelling, like you're doing a 2D scene or something. So I guess my short answer is, I don't know that I've ever successfully gotten the departments to fully trust the others to do this properly. One thing that has been a struggle for me is even just getting players to engage in the environment art. Like, it's the most expensive thing in your entire game in most cases, and a lot of times players just sort of stare at the minimap and drive around on the minimap, and it's like, well, wait a minute, why are we spending all this money on this beautiful vista if you're not even looking at
it? I appreciate the struggle. we've had a lot of that too. Yeah, well, I mean, I'm still curious about some of the aspects of at least how we've been learning. Okay, here's the purpose this needs to serve, and it's good enough. But even just the art, like, for example, we've been working on, luckily, nice thing about making a game in space is there aren't a lot of environments,
right.
aside from when you get down to a planet, and then even then it's sort of, Ur-Quan Masters abstracts it to a certain level. But space environment art is cheap. What's the most expensive art for us is probably, if you look at Ur-Quan Masters, it's probably, especially at the time, things like the conversation portraits, but the ships, certainly, like, they are the centerpieces. And we tend to think of ships as characters. I mean, they are like a character. We want them to have character and express that. And so, in working with an artist, how, especially someone who maybe is newer, and hasn't worked in games in a lot, and has, like we all have, a perfectionistic streak and wants everything to be the best it can be, communicating that, hey, this ship exists not just for someone to sit and stare at, like, up this close, but it's going to be flying 100 miles per hour. It's going to live for 10 seconds, and you're focused on trying not to die and trying to defeat the other ship. Like, the focal point of the player is going to be on something besides exactly how this texture looks on this ship right now.
Yeah, that's, it's the concept of great enough. Like, this is great enough. It's time to move on, is definitely because yeah, like, I understand my discipline and I look at my piece of content through that lens, often in isolation. So, like, you're having a combat on an empty plane. You're like, well, that's not how combat happens. or like, yeah, or I'm looking at the ship just in Blender, just by itself. And you're like, okay, well, that's not how this is going to happen. My preference is to as fast as possible to only do reviews sort of in real world. Like let's look at the ship in the game in the circumstances that you're going to be experiencing it, because it's not this big, it's this big, and it's not standing still, it's moving. So like if you can't see it, if you can't see the problem, then and you might be able to because you're the artist, so you still might be able to see it. But if you can't, I guarantee no player can.
Yeah.
Yeah. So how have you been able, I mean, obviously the first thing that comes to mind is technological challenges with like, okay, getting this thing actually in engine, in situ, with all the environment, whatever, and also even getting an artist to play the game. Certainly, yeah. I don't know, Fred, if you experienced more of this, but at Toys for Bob, like getting our artists to actually play the game was one challenge we had a lot. And they had it even when I worked at another Activision project, you know. So how have you found that process to go and say, hey, this is great when you stare at it, but as a player, we want you to feel more what it's like as a player. They might not be a designer, but how do you get them to?
I really like the idea of dailies where it's like senior people playing the game or having someone else play the game and bringing other people in to watch that experience, because it does two things. One, it really illustrates what's the worst thing right now, which I think is very important for people to know, is like, well, right now, what's the worst thing? But also, I think it helps people go, oh, wait, my thing is not the worst thing. In fact, it seems like the best thing, or at least it seems like a very good thing. So I don't know that I've ever successfully gotten the entire team consistently playing the game, but you can fake those things in other ways. Like dailies, I think are really good because I think it's important for people to see other people experiencing their content, because that helps them understand whether or not, well, like you have both things happening. Oh, it turns out the fact that my pinky finger isn't curling properly is completely invisible to everyone but me. But you also have it turns out my clunky UI that I thought was fine is a massive point of friction for everyone who's playing this game. So I guess it isn't okay. So like I think it's important for other people to see, ideally the target audience, but like whatever proxy you have of the target audience playing the game and seeing what actually matters. I was trying to use this production methodology called pile of sand, which is basically just that. Like, we're gonna focus on the most important thing, and then whatever. So it's like, okay, well, the worst thing in the game right now is the fact that the ship is a triangle. So we need to put a real ship in. Okay, but to put a real ship in, we need to decide how big the ships are. Well, to decide how big the ships are, and it's sort of like you allow the most important thing to force a bunch of decisions until you're out to to decide how fast the ships are, we need to decide how big the universe is. To decide that, we need to decide how big our install is going to be, and you end up with this sort of cone of it's literally basically the reason why I call it pile of sand is you're not planning exactly, you're just taking shovels full of sand and just throwing it on top of the pile of sand, and it's going to naturally form this cone of doneness. You're focusing sort of on the middle-ish and just allowing that process to force these decisions to be made. Now, not the most popular process I've ever tried to institute, because people like the guy that's building, if the guy that's building Planet 97, well, he already knows what it needs to be, right? And and that might be way out here at the edge of your pile of sand, so he feels like you don't care about him. And it's like, well, because kind of right now we don't. But so,
I mean, that's we've been dealing with it in our own ways. Have you ever been able to address that, or sort of even to take my very simple example of the ship? This thing exists for 8 seconds and is going to be blown up. It's like, how do you make someone's contributions feel like they are the most important thing, even when you're trying to get them to hit a lower target? You know,
ideally, you want every single person on your team to be able to draw a line back to so I don't necessarily know that you want everyone to feel that their thing is the most important thing, because I don't think that's possible or true. But I think you want everyone to be able to draw a line back to whatever you think is the most important thing. So it's like, okay, well, we're doing this 17 minutes of gameplay, and your ship exists in this 17 minutes. So it is inside of this part that we care about. We care about it, but it's only there for 8 seconds. So like, we care about it. We 8 seconds care about it.
Right. So there's sort of an alignment building, and I guess,
Yeah.
like, we appreciate, like, I want, of course, I want anybody who's doing any work on any project to feel like their contributions matter and it's
Yeah.
valuable, and then how do you, I guess this is where, like,
The smaller the team is, the easier I think it is, because it's like, if there are only 10 of us, then it's like, okay, obviously what I'm working on must matter to the most important thing, or I wouldn't be doing it, because there are only 10 of us. But when there are 250 of us, yeah, there are people that are like, and then I think what you end up having to do is forming these pockets of essentially extra little satellite piles of sand. It's like, yeah, we're doing a demo right now, but you're working on the thing that's going, you're working on the networking, you're working on the networking harness. The demo is single player, so we don't care about that. This doesn't care about that, but obviously that's super important. So we have you off, and we need to make you feel important on this secondary thing, because it is important and it will be important. And the bigger you get, the more of these you end up having. That is the fundamental flaw of Pile of Sand, is that, like, the bigger you get, the more you end up with these sort of like weird, and then what ends up often happening is you kind of end up having to put almost secondary, like, guidance and leadership in these, and they tend to start to, so what instead of sort of eventually getting covered over by the central pile as it gets big enough, which is what you'd hope would happen, is they start to pull away because they have a certain independence, and you end up having to go out and like pull them back.
Yeah, I after I worked at Toys for Bob for my entire career, I went and I did some project management, actually. So I went from design engineering to project management, and outside of games too, specifically. Right. So I really appreciated that and learned a lot from it. But looking back at what we did at Toys for Bob, at least with the sort of my team and the teams I interacted with, really felt a lot like that. And one of our strong suits, I think, especially if you go back and look at Toys for Bob games, at least from when I joined, is people could kind of do whatever they wanted. And a lot of games wound up being that way. And,
Right.
Especially if you look at stuff we did before Skylanders, it was, there's a lot of one-off experiences, because we kind of optimized for designers being able to do that. And that's a product of our mindset, and
right.
The tools we had even allowed that. So it's sort of like an organic thing that got created. But when I look at some of the challenges, aside from layers of communication being difficult, one of the challenges is exactly what you brought up, what I call, and I didn't coin this term, I forget where I heard it, feature fighters, where you wound up with the pile of sand, but then somewhere on the periphery, there was something that got a lot of gravity. And one person, let's just say, it's easier to think about as one person, said, my little thing is the most important, and I'm going to cling to it and fight for it. Like, have you experienced that? And,
Yeah, I mean, probably the most, so there are two features in Inquisition where, like, I think you can have, I don't even know if he necessarily needs to be a person. I think sometimes features on their own kind of happen. So Inquisition originally was going to be, the idea was that it was going to be, your organization was going to be more of a thing. Like, you were going to be capturing strongholds and building up forces and, like, essentially holding territory, like almost like it's a like a little RTS inside of the game. But like, just even saying that out loud, you're like, but wait, then you're like, what? It started to take over the game. Like, you could see right away that, like, this is going to turn the game into an RTS, and that's not the game we're trying to make. So, like, that feature we'd essentially cut the feature. Todd Howard talked about this with mounts in Skyrim, with the same thing, which is like mounts. We made mounts worse because they were becoming too important, and we didn't want them to become too important. I do think that features all on their own can start to become like gravity wells, like you said, and then if you have a champion, then they're like, well, this is awesome. If we just put in a bit more resources, it would be even more awesome. And then it just like sucks resources into it. If you have an individual, because the other thing that can happen, I think, is just that an individual really wants this to be a different game, and they're building they're essentially trying to form one of those features. They're trying to create a feature that is a gravity well on its own because they wish this was a fighting game instead of a action RPG. And so they're trying to make the fighting really awesome so that it can become a fighting game. I mean, you eventually got to pull them up short. But like, you kind of want to give them as much rope as you can, because like they're really into it. They're really running. You kind of want to see how far you can let them go. But yeah, eventually you got to say, well, it's not a fighting game.
I think like, well, it's a little bit of a pivot too, but carrying that on, it's like we want all the enthusiasm pointed in a slightly different direction.
Exactly. Like that's the ideal is like you're pulling at like 7 Gs in this direction. Can we make you just turn? If we can't, can we just have someone pulling on you to just cause you to turn, to just like your energy is still going 100% north, but we're just nudging you enough that the work is going, even if your attention is still off, at least we're getting 80% of your work pointed at the final target. Because the act of, with some people, the act of realigning them, you might drop them from, they're at 100% efficiency going this way. If you turn them 45 degrees, you're only going to get 30% efficiency. So better to leave them pointing in the wrong direction and having someone else correcting them than trying to realign them. But it depends. Some people very mobile. They can aim at whatever you want. So if that's the case, it's just like, well, let's just take the time, stop, turn you 45 degrees and aim you at 100% in a different direction. But often the people that are like those really crazy sources of enthusiasm and pressure, like, yeah, they're enthusiastic because they have a vision. So you need to either substitute that vision or figure out how to just guide it, put a little bit over this way.
Yeah, we kind of had that problem in Ur-Quan Masters with planet compositions, where initially Paul really wanted to go physically accurate, whatever that means, and scientific, and you're going to have this much ammonium, which means you're going to have this much sulfides in the, blah, 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 blah. And when we started to represent that in the game, it didn't come through, just these, right. Oh, here's another brown planet. Here's another brown planet. Here's another brown planet. And it wasn't until we said, well, let's make the planets kind of more part of the story and actually name them like treasure worlds. And yes, the composition might end up in the final way that we would procedurally generate the planet, but the planets would become much more characters, which was more appropriate to what we were making than the scientific approach.
I do think that there is like there are like it's incredibly important for your vision to be right, and vision at a feature level to be understood. And sometimes the individual developers are going to own that vision. But often, in my experience, when people are saying they don't understand, they're not actually saying they don't understand. They're saying, I don't agree. I'm going to manifest my disagreement as confusion. So eventually, you've got to say, like, we're not making a planet composition simulator. We're making a game where you explore cool planets that have cool names. So like planets are like that's great. Like saying planets are characters as a vision statement for planets is incredibly helpful, because then when it's like, well, does scientifically accurate compositions of planets help that vision, hurt that vision, or is it neutral? And it's like, well, actually, yeah, it kind of hurts it because it's going to make all the planets be kind of brown. So that's not great. That's bad, because if we all agree planets are characters, which we should have gotten alignment on, then this is a problem. And I think that's helpful, because like I'm pulling slightly differently in a slightly different place than you would want me to, but it's basically under the umbrella of the vision. I think you kind of want to encourage that. Just be like, okay, well, is the direction you're pushing bad or just different? If it's just different, great, then let's go with it. But if it's wrong, then it's like, well, like how are we misaligned to the point that you think this is a fighting game when everything we've said says it isn't? Or were we not clear enough? And you're somehow able to think it's a fighting game. What the problem with vision statements, like is, they are definitely fragile, or like
open to a lot of interpretation.
Yeah, like especially what I would consider illegitimate interpretation. Like, I know this isn't a fighting game, but you said like conflict is king or something. And it's like, well, fighting is conflict, so therefore it fits under the umbrella. And it's like, perfectly well that's not what I meant. And we're not going to add like 9 other sentences to because that also destroys the vision. If it's like, okay, I'm gonna like Reddit post this with tons of exceptions and caveats to try to make it unassailable, it's like, well, that's just going to destroy the effectiveness of it as well.
Yeah, it's the classic D&D rules is intended, rules is written kind of thing. Just
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I totally understand. I mean, so one interesting nuance, I'm actually just legitimately curious if you've ever dealt with this. So here's an actual thing that's happening with our project, which is there was a game, the Ur-Quan Masters. It released in, originally 1992, and people played it, and they had a long time to think about what that game was, what it meant to them. Maybe they experienced it when they were young, and there's nostalgia. Now, here we are, 30 plus years in the future, and we are working on a sequel. And so the sequel to the Ur-Quan Masters, when you say, here's what the sequel for the Ur-Quan Masters is, that vision statement is, if you're explaining that to someone else and they were a fan of the original, they might already have their own vision statement for what the sequel is in their head. And you're coming to them and saying, one of the things we are doing is using our community to help, contribute to the game. So they've had 30 years to think about it. They might have their own vision statement. And because they're fans, one thing I'll just say, I adore our community, and they have a ton of passion and a ton of enthusiasm. How have you ever dealt with this? Or like something we're still navigating, figuring out is, okay, how do you take someone who's a fan of something, and maybe using the Thanksgiving metaphor, they got to be a real big fan of cranberry sauce. And then here you are, Thanksgiving dinner too. It's like, yes, we will still have cranberry sauce, but it's not the main dish,
Right.
How do you build that alignment when not only it's sort of like it's harder to unlearn something than it is to learn something, so there's some of that. Like, have you ever dealt with that with yours, like franchises, especially with fandoms?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that definitely, I think working with the community is exactly what you need to do for this, because I think you saw this with BG3, where it's like the community came along with them. And so the compromises that are there, the fandom largely knew they were there already. Like, they kind of were almost part of the decision-making process of why they were there. They may not have wanted those, but they kind of got it that they were there. So I do think, like, okay, right, I really love cranberries. I wanted this to be a main dish, and you're telling me, oh, it's going to be a side dish. I'm kind of mad about it, but I'm going to like kind of sit with it, and I'll kind of I'll either get okay with it, or I'll leave your community, one or the other. So I do think that is vitally important in this case. But I think it's a tough place, because it's like, this is obviously not, this game is not for the person who was playing it when Ur-Quan Masters came out, because that person doesn't exist anymore. Because even though they might have been that human might exist, but they've changed. in the last 30 years, and they've changed in a bunch of different ways. So like I think having them involved in the conversation is vitally important. But I think part of this might be, so on Jade Empire, we constantly ran into this thing where people would play like during development, where people would play Jade Empire and they would be like, on KOTOR, this was so much better. And it's like, but eventually it's like, okay, look, we've got a kit with KOTOR on it. You go to the thing you're talking about and show me that it's better. And it's like, no, it was never better. It was always worse because you would just put all this Vaseline on the lens in your memory. And I think that this game will have that problem with a lot of the core, not the core that's still playing the game once a month, because that's like on a broad level, I guess you're dealing with two core members. I think people who are replaying Ur-Quan Masters over and over again. They're very aware of what this game is. And then there are people that play, like me. I haven't played it in probably 10 years. So I mean, even I've played it since it came much more recently than when it came out, but it's been a while. So I don't remember exactly how it played, but I kind of remember all the things I like. So I've made it better in my mind. I've made it better than it actually was. In fact, I remember this happening with Blizzard with I guess Diablo 4. No, it's probably Diablo 3, where it was Diablo 3 when they were showing their early stuff and people were like, it's too colorful. It's and it's like, so they were, but it's like it looks like an up-res version of Diablo 2, but you don't remember that game. You remember your memory of that game. So I do think that having, like, I think that for a game like this, with if a big part of your audience is your core, which I think it is, I think doing the development out loud is really important. And I guess, like, I don't think Baldur's Gate 2 fans were a huge percentage. Well, they weren't. Were not a huge percentage of Larian's sales for BG3, but they were still an important part. But I think with that group was inside of their core to a large degree, because they were probably playing Divinity Original Sin, and they were inside of Larian's bubble mostly already. So they were in that conversation. And I think this game is really like that. Whereas, like, you need those people to be along for the ride and understand where you're going, why you're making the decisions you're making, even if they then decide, you know what, I'm not happy with this. I'm just gonna go play Ur-Quan Masters again. At least they're making an informed decision and they're not firebombing you on launch day. And because I mean, at this point, like, some of your audience, I mean, a bunch of your audience were not born when this game came out. So, like, there are, I think this is by its very nature, there are things that you are going to do that for the corest of core, the people who have not changed since 1982, are going to react badly to, because the industry, gaming, everything has changed in the last 40 years. And even most of the remainder of your core want it to change. They want this game to be more modern. Maybe they don't want it to be straight, like, maybe they don't want it to be a game straight out of 2024, but they want it to move forward some. So there are going to be people, like the oldest of old school, that are going to be like, if this doesn't play exactly like the game that is laser stamped into my brain, are going to be upset. I think with them, you just want them to understand that it's happening. I don't think you're going to get them there necessarily, but you can at least get them to accepting, maybe.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's really insightful. I think what we've seen happen with our community is, in general, if you get somebody stirred up in a good way, right?
Yeah,
They can help bring other people along for the
absolutely.
ride. And so, like, I mean, look, people are still making Doom mods. You know, if you want
Yeah,
to go make a Doom mod, go make a Doom
yeah.
mod. It's a, you know, it's still there. You can still
Mhm.
go make an Ur-Quan Masters mod. You know, there's like, not to tease anyone, but you know, we just individual remarks sometimes stick out to me because they're very like 90 degrees from where my head is. And you know, there was a recent remark about, why don't you just use the old engine? And
Right.
I'm just like, I'm so confused, because I understand why someone could make that statement, but I also go, but it runs at 20 frames per second and it renders at like 320 by 240. I don't know if that's not what I was thinking. But one thing we've seen work is, hey, rather than try to address the nitpickers, do the inverse and find the people who are already along for the ride
Yeah, I think
and
you're
amplify
actually.
them.
I think you're wise. I think you're much better. That yeah, you know, I think you're that's that. I think you're wise. I think it's more about understanding that those other people are not coming along for the ride, and just giving as many tools to the people that are like, oh well, this looks like what you. I think what you want. And this was my experience with Diablo 3 was it it looks like what I remember Diablo looking like. Then I went and looked at Diablo and went, it's and I think that's kind of what you want. It's like this feels like what I remember Ur-Quan Master feeling like. And I know that is, but I know I am wrong, but it feels like that, or feels even better than that, as opposed to it is exactly like Ur-Quan Masters. I don't think you want that. That's wrong. You want to evoke those same emotions. So the members of your core that are getting excited about the things you're doing, yeah, like you said, like pour gasoline on them, give them the tools to be louder, because they're getting it.
Yeah, it's a real, I don't want to say struggle is the wrong word, but it's a real interesting challenge, because you have a lot of people. I mean, we're indie for the first time, right, Fred and I, and
Right.
so it's like it's a blessing. So many people could wish that anybody cared about what you're doing as an indie developer, and it's like, oh wow, I'm so excited all of these people are here. You know, I don't want to dismiss them. I want to make everybody feel good. The thing that's hard is they, like I said, like we're saying, like they played this game 30 years ago. They're a different person. Technology has changed. Games have changed. Even the idea of a hard time limit is something that's
Right.
been, and even time carrying on is just such an interesting design conceit, and it feels very like anachronistic. And melee combat itself is very unusual, which I think is useful actually in this case, because people, you know, it's like a fighting game but played with weird physics, and that's neat.
Yeah.
But so many people had their own experience, and what's interesting is their own experience of the Ur-Quan Masters and what it was fractures out in different directions.
Yeah.
And you know, that Vaseline isn't even just the same Vaseline, it's very different Vaseline. And so we'll get people who want it to be a 4X game, we'll get people who want all kinds of different things out of it. And it's hard, I don't want to say hard, but it's an interesting challenge to find a way to say, like, hey, we're all one community, I guess, here for one reason, and we love this game. I have the unique advantage, I don't know if it's an advantage of having never really played the story mode of Ur-Quan Masters until fairly recently. So I don't have any nostalgia about it. I just straight up thought it was a fighting game, you know, space fighting game. And then, oh, there's a story. I learned about it. And so one thing that, like, when we're trying to build alignment with the community and do development in the open, is learning how to tune our message so that we're not coming at them from left field. So something I wouldn't necessarily say to them, but I say to myself sometimes, and I've said to other members on the team, is the most Ur-Quan Masters like game I've played since the Ur-Quan Masters has been Spiritfarer, which is a game about sailing a boat and, you know, sending people to their afterlife. If you said that to someone and they're coming from like, oh, I want a space game like Mass Effect and Ur-Quan Masters, they'd just be confused, like, well, there's no spaceship. But that's a very like nuts and bolts.
Yeah.
Look, I dissolved it into the component chemicals and put it back together. So like what you said kind of rung true to me is, and still tuning the message is, we want you to feel like you felt when you played Ur-Quan Masters.
Yes.
And there are a few distinct elements. For example, like you have agency in Ur-Quan Masters. The universe kind of revolves around you. Yeah, you get to see things are happening, but it's only because you started it or the time it happened, right?
Yeah.
And so explaining to them, no, these little details and these little things on the fringes aren't important, but back to that vision statement, the one we toss around is, be the captain. You are the captain. And, you know, so like you brought fail better games, like Sunless Skies is a good example of that too, where it's like, well, there's a living, breathing universe, but the universe revolves around you.
And the universe is kind of, it's waiting for you to be, doesn't want to sit on your shoulder.
He was like, yeah, just take me away.
And I think that the more that you can have those set statements, and maybe even say some of those statements to the community, like if physics-based space combat is a core thing, it's like, yeah, okay, let's say that. And you're like, okay, right. So now you're pinning down, like that's a thing. It's like, okay, and I start to be able to, even though I've, like you said, I've painted an imaginary sequel in my mind sometime in the early 90s. I was like, oh, and I've been sort of like planning my wedding since I was 7. Like, it's like, well, now it's reality. Like, and because you're right, like for some people, the sequel to Ur-Quan Masters is something like Mass Effect, but I mean, mechanically, they're not the same. I mean, you can see the fingerprints. It's like, but like, it's like the opposite of what you said, where it's like you've just instead of distilling it down to the core chemical mechanics and putting it back together, it's distilled down to the core elements of setting and putting it back together. So like it's gone very different branches.
Yeah, totally. It's I guess we're working with someone who's helping us do like some marketing, business development stuff, and as I've explained to him, like, educational has been the tone that's felt most successful and most true and honest. Is like, we need to, I don't need to everybody in our community to become a game designer, but talking to them with respect and saying, you know, hey, this is how we experience it. This is what we think is fun about this. And this is the kind of fun we want you to have. Has been like a pretty powerful and positive message, because it's really hard to argue with someone saying, well, someone wants me to have fun. I mean, yes, of course you will get the classic, you know, people fighting in the forum about some pixel or whatever, but that's great. You know, they can mod it, they can fix it, they'll have all the fun with it when they can get their hands on it. It's harder when it's more fantastical. And I think what you said is helpful, like pin down some things, make some things to pin down so that they can start filling in the canvas, as opposed to like you said, I've been planning this in my head for 30 years and I don't see it yet, or I'm seeing bits and pieces, but it's all abstract and I don't know what I can like actually hang my hat on and say, okay, I'm safe here.
Yeah. Like, am I getting a horse carriage for my wedding? I probably not, but but I imagine that. So like, to some degree, you also maybe need some people to, if there are some features that are commonly wanted, but are just impractical. I don't know what that would be, but that, like, it's probably worthwhile having the conversation about the fact that they're not going to get those things, whatever those might be. I can't think of what that would be, but
the good news is our game, you know, Ur-Quan Masters is old enough that it's less about the you know, we're missing new features and more about, well, there wasn't a lot there to begin with, so what are we putting into the mix, and how is that going to change things up? Co-op,
yeah, because that's
hard.
I was like literally trying to think of a feature from Ur-Quan Masters that would be impractical.
24 frames per second. I'll say that's the one. 24 frames per second gameplay is not impractical. It's just might turn a lot of people off.
It would be. I can't imagine. Yeah. So is it locked? Is Ur-Quan Masters locked at 24? So you can put it on your like $6,000 gaming PC, and it's okay, interesting.
And it has, I believe, 16. Is that right? 16 fixed rotations, and which actually creates gameplay. But I think we experiment with it. It would be really hard to get a modern player to pick that up and go, "These are the rules."
yeah, I remember that creating game, because it gives you it's the whole mouse and keyboard for playing a shooter thing. It's like, yeah, there's a certain there's a precision that comes with it.
Yeah, it's a learning experience for us, and also kind of, well, gosh, here's the rules we have to break. You know, here are the promises we do need to break, you know, from the original game, because it's going to be, you know, hard to attract new players, because obviously, look, I'd love if everyone is a fan of the Ur-Quan Masters, but even more, I'd love if they're a fan of what we're doing now, because
Yeah,
that's the
and
game
I mean,
we're
this
working on.
definitely needs to be a game that needs to be at least approachable for a new person. Because yeah, like it's like, well, if you want to play this game, go play this game from 30 years ago. That's a non-starter for most people. So yeah, so you're right. Like you can't do 24 frames a second and say, oh, it's we did it because it's what the classic did. Like
it's canon
it's
frame
canon,
rate.
exactly. I mean, you see this with pixel art indie titles where it's like, yeah, they are pixel art, but they're not taking the other constraints of being an 8-bit game.
Yeah, exactly. It's just a sort of style choice.
Like it's a style choice.
I've chosen to work in black and white. You know, you don't have to, but you can.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, I think we've been here for a little over an hour or something. Mm-hmm. Fred, do you have any other fun things for the mix? I could talk forever, but I don't want to eat up all your time.
No, do you have anything you want to ask of us, Mark? Or
well, I mean, I'd be curious to when can we see more?
Well, I mean, for public, and for you, I'd be happy to give you a demo of what we have running and our tech, and we'll show you just what we have at the moment. But for public, we've been sharing blog posts as we go. A lot of our work has been we're Fred and I are designer and engineer, respectively. So we don't have an artist as sort of the core member of the team, and we've been building a lot of gameplay and a lot of design and technologies too. So like supporting multiplayer is a pretty important part.
Yeah.
Bird ride. So supporting multiplayer is pretty important, but we've started to show more of our art and more of our visual flair, I guess, as it is, and imagining, look, the core fantasy, especially in combat, is I've got a cool ship, it's powerful. Do I get a cool missile, a cool laser? Do I feel like I have agency? And like being able to show that is good. What is harder, I guess I'm still not necessarily answering your question. What's harder to show, is, hey, here's the story. And that's actually even a challenge for us, because we want to tease the story, but also we want you to experience the story.
Yeah, I mean, I think that probably the most important thing to show from a story perspective is like to show another race, like to show that, like, not the story so much as, oh, look, it's something something you will recognize, or something that's not even necessarily recognized, evocative of something from Ur-Quan Masters, and you're like, oh, okay. Like, I don't think you need to show the story exactly. We need to show like the primary conflict and a little bit of setting, I think, is really what is going to get people going.
Yeah, the sort of the trifecta that I guess I've been using in my head to explain to a few different people is, we want something human and relatable. We want something scary and menacing. And then if it wouldn't be Ur-Quan Masters if it didn't have something just straight up weird.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking, was like something weird is the thing you really want, is yeah.
So something that like an old, like a, and again, this is where the community can also be interesting, because they might want something that's different than, say, a Mass Effect fan who never played Ur-Quan Masters would want, which is, I play space games. I love space games. If you show me a cool spaceship, I'll be real happy. Whereas an Ur-Quan Masters fan is like, I need to know what happened to this fringe race from Ur-Quan Masters. What are they doing right now? And it's like, well, most people probably won't be super interested in that, but we want to respect you and like get you excited about that, right? And maintain that enthusiasm. So, I think we're kind of going into holidays, so we're going to be quiet here, but I guess what I can share, which sounds like such a vague PR answer, is beginning of next year, we're going to be going for more of this stuff. And, hopefully, if it's okay with you, we'd like to use some like clips from talking with you to help us promote things too.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, cool. Well, yeah. Did you have anything else?
No, that's awesome.
Cool. So as far as like using this video, we haven't really talked about like what permission anybody has to anything. As far as I'm concerned, everybody can share everything, around, but if it's okay with you, we'll be in touch in a little bit and say like, hey, we're going to put it up on our channel. If you want to put it on your channel, you can let you know when it is. If that's cool with you, of course, we can send you the recording. Is that all right?
Yep, that sounds great.
Perfect.
Great.
All right.
Nice to
Thank you
talk
so
to you.
much.
Yes,
Yeah.
nice to talk to you as well. Thank you so much.
And also just sort of like on/off the record, but just to fanboy for a little bit, like I really appreciate your channel and like your POTS video actually, and kind of working with our contributors, people who are new to game development, giving them that has been like so helpful, trying to get people onboarded to like make it and move on, make it and move on. And so like I really appreciate what you've been doing, and you know, it's nice, like it's actually helped our project. So I just want to say thank you. All right. Well, great talking with you. I'll be in touch soon.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you so much.
All right.
All right.
Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.